In this video tutorial, I want to tackle the concept of the bit depth that you should bring images from Lightroom into Photoshop or from in through the Camera Raw module. Which bit depth should you use? And it's a little bit complex, but it's actually not too bad once you start getting your head around it. And I've always made the suggestion that people use 16-bit because 16-bit gives you more colors to work with. And there are actually two sort of forces at play. One is the color gamut, which is the sort of color space. How many individual different colors do you have? Like how many, you have orange and green and blue, and so those different hues. And then the bit depth actually helps you to understand how many steps between colors. So how many steps of blue can you create? How many steps of green can you create? And it has to do with how the files are composed and saved. But before we get there, let me show you where you make this setting so that when you bring things into Photoshop, they use the bit depth that you like. So the first thing, I'm just going to start in Photoshop, and I'm going to choose File. I've got a Camera Raw file here that I already have open in Photoshop, but let's start with the Camera Raw module. And in the Camera Raw module, down at the bottom, if you click on this link here, it brings up your workflow options. And you have two choices here that impact things. First off, I'm a big proponent of using ProPhoto RGB because that gives you the most number of hues that you can get among the settings here. sRGB is by far the most restrictive. It's sort of the lowest common denominator. It was actually created in the early days of the web so that if someone had a very low bit depth or a very low very inexpensive monitor, essentially, you could kind of cram all the colors into the space that monitor supports. And it was designed to give, like I said, the lowest common denominator. Adobe RGB is not actually a bad one, but it's more related to color workflows that end up in CMYK. And it was kind of designed for that. So it's a little smaller than ProPhoto RGB, which is by far the largest. And so I use that because I always want the most. I want the most options I can get. Now, the depth, the bit depth. This is where you can choose 8 bits or 16 bits per channel. I recommend 16 bits per channel, and I'll explain why you might want 8 bits per channel, because more always seems like better, and there are some drawbacks, and I'll cover those in just a moment, but this is where you set that. So once you set that, what happens is when the Camera Raw module goes to convert this file to a Photoshop file, so I'll click OK, I'll click Open Image, the Camera Raw module is going to convert this from raw data into a PSD file, or I believe, nope, it's going to be a PSD file. In Lightroom, I can make it a TIFF if I want. When I click Open Image, it's going to hand it over to Photoshop. It's going to make it 16 bits or 8 bits. Choose within the color space that you've chosen. And the goal that I always have is to give myself the most options possible in that moment. So we'll go ahead and click Open Image. And I'm actually going to cancel it because I've already taken the time to open this up. And I've done it twice, one at 16 bits, and you can see it says RGB 16 bits, and I've done it at RGB 8 bits. There's a little 8 there. Now, before I continue and explain sort of what happens and why I like 16 bits versus 8 bits, let's just quickly jump over to Lightroom, and I just want to talk you through setting it there. In Lightroom, I always work in RAW in Lightroom. I do recommend that, although you can work in JPEG if you like. I'm going to choose among my preferences, so Lightroom, Preferences, the External Editing Preferences, the file format. So in Lightroom, I can choose to go to TIFF if I want. I always choose PSD just because there's no advantage to me for TIFF, so I'll just use PSD. Color space, again, Adobe RGB, sRGB, or ProPhoto. I recommend ProPhoto. And here's your bit depth. So I can choose 8 bits or 16 bits. Now, I've already done a session on resolution, so if you're interested in that, I'll point you back to that. And if you look in the Photoshop Lightroom group where I'm posting this, you'll see that the resolution module or the resolution movie is there. So I'm just going to leave that alone. But ProPhoto RGB, 18 bits, the most color and the most steps between color that I can get. Then when I choose Photo, Edit in Photoshop, I'll get the image that set the way that I have chosen the preferences to be set. And I can change this back and forth, so it's not something that I have to live with. If I set up a bunch of files, move them over to Photoshop as 8-bit, and then realize I want to move to 16-bit, come back, reset the preferences, go back over to Photoshop, and I'm good to go. Oh, one other thing about Lightroom. If I don't want to choose each individual photo to edit in, I can also choose File, Export, and among the export options, if I want to export to the hard drive, I can choose a file setting, color space, and bit depth here. These are these would override any of the preferences that I set. So if I have, one day I just want to do a bunch of 8-bit work, I can set that here. So we'll go ahead and cancel that. Okay, so I'm in Photoshop now. However I got there, the question is, why would I choose 16-bit over 8-bit? And here's 16-bit, here's 8-bit. Well, I'm going to answer the reverse question first and tell you the drawbacks. And there are 2 drawbacks, 3, I guess, technically. Drawback number 1, if you look at the size of this file, and I'm going all the way down here to the lower left, you can see that the file is about 60 megabytes in size. A large file, but really not that big for a file this with these dimensions and pixel resolution in Photoshop. I come over to the 16-bit version and notice that the file size jumps. In fact, it's double. And it sort of makes sense mathematically because 8 is half of 16. Each pixel is carrying or can carry twice as much potential information. Now, when I say potential information, let me explain kind of what's happening here, because really what's happening, if I come over here to Windows, Channels, I've actually got this open here, so I'll open this panel. What's happening is an RGB color file has 3 channels, some red, some green, some blue information. What I can do is turn off the channels and see what the green information looks like, what the blue and red information looks like. The darker it is, the more intensely red it's going to be. Now, the reason that that pole isn't completely intensely red is because the red, the green, the blue are all combining together, and dark colors in RGB means actually darkness. Light colors means almost white. So if you look up in this area here, it's fairly gray, and on each of the channels, if I look, it looks pretty gray in each of the channels, and that's just because there's actually a lot of light coming, and so it's essentially less intensely that color, more white. But with respect to the bit depth, what's happening is that each channel in an 8-bit file has 256 levels of red that it can use to display a color. 256 levels of green, 256 levels of blue. And in this image here, where I'm going from a gray to a not very dark blue, it's a real challenge for Photoshop to create a smooth look without creating what's called banding. And I'm going to show you the effect of banding in just a moment. But in a 16-bit file, what you have is more than 256, and I don't have the math off the top of my head, but it's a lot more than 256 steps of red, of green, of blue, and that means that there are a lot more spaces in between each color step that Photoshop can use when calculating how to make this file look when you apply effects to it. And so when you apply effects, whether it's from image, adjustments, you apply these effects, or it's from the filter menu, or even the adjustment layers. So even if I were to do this using adjustment layers, I'll come in here and apply them here. You're asking Photoshop to use math to create the final pixel colors that are going to be used in that. And when you start to apply effect over effect over effect, what ends up happening is that Photoshop has to throw away data and make up new data in the form of color. And when Photoshop has to do that without a lot of color to work with, Photoshop ends up creating banding. I'm going to show you that in a very sort of dramatic way. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to the 8-bit color, choose Image, Adjustments, Levels, and I'm just going to squeeze all of the colors into a very narrow band, and you can see it almost looks like the fog rolled in. There's not much color, there's not much contrast. The image is, it's terrible. But if I want to undo that, I'll go back to Image, Adjustments, Levels, and to fix that, I'm just going to say, hey, Photoshop, take that spectrum of color right there and spread it back out again. And you can see that as I'm starting to do that, the banding problem, even in the preview, starts to make itself apparent. But when I click OK, Photoshop's going to run some numbers. It's going to try to undo that, but if you look carefully, not sure how this is showing up through the video, but I can see there are definite waves. It looks like a moire pattern, like you're looking at this through a screen. That's the kind of banding that you have as a problem with an 8-bit file. Now, if you don't do a lot of editing to your files after you bring them into Photoshop or bring them over from Lightroom, you may never see this as a problem, and so the fact that you have a 60 megabyte file versus a 120 megabyte file may make no difference to you, or the resulting 16-bit file might not be worth it to you to invest that doubling of file size. But when you start editing and you do 2 or 3 edits, some of this banding can appear, and that's when you might make the choice to go ahead and use 16-bit. Now let me show you what happens in a 16-bit file when I do the exact same thing. I'm going to choose Image, Adjustments, Levels, and we'll squeeze all the color into that same narrow band. And when I say the exact, these numbers might be a little bit different, but you can see the effect is very much the same. Click OK. We'll come back to Image, Adjustments, Levels, and we'll try and fix it. Bring these back. And in the preview, you can see the banding is still there, but let's let Photoshop do its math. And the result is much smoother. If I look very, very carefully, actually, I really can't see any banding in this file at all. So between the two of them, this file versus this file, you can see that what I have bought, if you will, with the 16 bits, the extra file space, the extra processing time that it takes to work with that amount of data, is more editing flexibility. So I can go ahead and continue to work with this file and get more interesting effects into the file without worrying about running into a problem of banding. Now, there is one more drawback, and I forgot to mention it, so I do want to come back and talk about that. In an 8-bit file, under the filter menu, all of my filters are here. There's nothing missing. In a 16-bit file, if I choose filter, you'll see that some of them, not all of them, actually not even many of them, but a few of them are grayed out. And that's just because the math that goes into applying those filters is sufficiently complex that the additional data represented by 16 bits per channel is just too much for Photoshop to have to think about. It's probably actually just that the math wasn't, or the filters weren't written for 16 bits. And so in a case like that, I might want to apply all of the image editing techniques that I want, and at that point then I can always come over here to Image Mode and convert it to an 8 bits per channel file. And the advantage of doing that is that I get the ability to work with all of the image editing effect under the Image Adjustments menu without seeing significant banding, as long as I don't go absolutely crazy with it, and then convert it over to apply my filters. In that case, what I will probably do is do a file save as and save a 16-bit version of the PSD file, because I always want to keep that data around, and just in case I want to do something else with it. So 8 bits, 16 bits. The drawbacks to 8-bit, the drawbacks to 16-bit requires more processing power, requires more hard drive space, and will eliminate the ability to work with some filters depending on what the filters are. The advantage to 8-bit is that you can work with all the filters that you want. It's a smaller file, requires less processing power, but the disadvantage, and unfortunately it can be a significant disadvantage as you start to edit the file, is that you can run into these banding problems because Photoshop just doesn't have the same number of color steps with which to work. So my recommendation, work in 16-bit when you're working with digital photography. You'll get more color to work with. You'll have more ability to edit the file using Image Edit. And even if you don't run into this banding problem right away, you may run into the problem somewhere down the road when you're trying to edit it. So I like 16-bit for that reason, and that's the bit depth choice that I recommend.